Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister. In this episode, we talk about expertise, that dreaded word. What is it? What can it do? What can it not do? With some sort of side remarks about the whole Joe Rogan and Douglas Murray debate that took place recently. We hope this is helpful to you. Once again, if you find value in what we do in our podcast, our speaking ministry, you can support us by going to www.toltogether.com. Also, like, share, and spread the word about us. It really does help. Thanks so much.
Cameron, there's been a concern that's developing, I think, perhaps within the I don't know which political category you would call it, but it kind of came to a head in a conversation that Douglas Murray was having with Dave Smith on the Joe Rogan podcast about how we think about expertise, who has a voice and a platform, and who gets to encourage certain ideas and voices. And the argument goes like this, and I think a lot of us, when we slow down and think about it, will be sympathetic to the. Now, I mean, Douglas Murray is not like this like he comes out swinging basically in any conversation that he's in. So consider the source here. But he had said to Joe Rogan that he thinks there's a rising danger and tendency for people who have massive platforms to speak to political or otherwise topics with a high degree that comes across as expertise, where they then have the ability to just step back and be like, well, don't take my word for it. I'm a comedian. And so if you look at the Joe Rogans, the Tim Dillons, the Theo Vaughns, the Russell Brand, there's this entire ecosystem where the podcasters have won and are now much larger gorillas in the fight of the media expression. They're no longer fringe. They are like now the mainstream. However, they aren't act so they would all come back and say, "We aren't acting like experts. We're just talking to the people we want to talk to, and we're just giving our advice." And Douglas Murray is like, "Yeah, but you have to look at the downstream impact of that." Um, and so this whole like, I'm giving very informed opinions and information and platforming certain voices, and I'm propagating those voices to more people than the normal news source. You just got to be careful there. And immediately there's going to be a pushback of saying, yeah, well, like I just talked, like, why are you saying, like, don't you believe in free speech? Can't I just say whatever I want to say? And he's saying, yeah, absolutely, you can. But it turned into this embroiled thing about what it means to be an expert on something and who can have a voice and who can have a say and to what degree, like, if you develop a massive platform, how responsible are you for what the people who are absorbing the content you're producing, what's the degree of responsibility that you have of the people who are downstream of the stuff that you're saying, especially if you're not technically claiming to be an expert, but you have far more political and emotional authority and sway than you would traditionally have claimed to have had as a mere podcaster. That's the starting point of where things started to go sideways, but I'm going to pause there for you to ask any questions of clarification. Have I set up the dynamic of the problem clearly enough there?
I think so. Three things come to mind for me right here. One is the celebrity problem, which is not new, but it's a relative newcomer. The other is the disingenuous note that's wrung by some of these people when they have this massive influence and then out of, seem to disavow any responsibility when that happens. And the third one is just that, yeah, that expertise kind of question. Let me just introduce a few thoughts on each of those, and then I want to hear you go with this. But the celebrity piece is you have somebody who is famous as a actor or somebody who's an actor in popular culture, whether that's an actor themselves or a performer. So the first big kind of major example I can think of this in recent years was Elvis Presley when he bursts onto the scene, and there's massive concern about the influence he's having on younger people. They called him Elvis the Pelvis. Of course, he didn't never called himself that and didn't particularly like that nickname, but it stuck. But ever since Elvis, the same questions have been happening over and over again with famous people. You know, a lot of people are very affected by your behavior. How do you think about your influence, and do you think that it's your responsibility to have a positive influence? And different people have answered that different ways. In recent years, a lot of rappers, particularly in, as it used to be called gangsta rap, although that's a little bit of a funny title. But think about, I remember years ago when Lil Wayne was interviewed and they said, "Well, your songs are filled with violence," and the typical questions reporters always ask. Do you feel any sense of responsibility? And he said, "Absolutely none whatsoever. I'm not a role model. I just do this." So it's that same conversation again. I just want to point that out in passing. But what's interesting here with the podcasting piece and what seems to be a bit of a new development, Nathan, is that traditional gatekeeping doesn't keep some of these people out anymore. So to back up again and use the music analogy, used to be the case that in terms of popular culture, what you heard on the radio was mostly what you were gonna get, and it was largely the record companies, and, there were cultural gatekeepers in place. It was record companies who would release the music in the first place, who would bankroll the albums, which cost a lot of money to produce, blah, blah, blah. But then it was actually critics and journalists who would review and assess, and they, believe it or not, it sounds crazy to us today, but there was a time when reviews could make or break bands and make or break
Mhm.
certain actors and all of that. Critics had that kind of cultural power. That dynamic has shifted dramatically in recent years. There's much more of a populist kind of dynamic. Because, I mean, how many people do you know, Nathan, who take the critics' reviews of movies really seriously
I know
and think,
one.
"Oh, well,
I do a podcast
yeah,
twice a week with him.
right." But for the most part, I mean, people are gonna go to sites like Rotten Tomatoes, and they're gonna look but what do audiences actually have to say? People who vote with their feet. And so that
Well,
dynamic has shifted there too. So, but with these podcasters and people like that, or people who've gained a platform on YouTube, or their podcast has come through other. Basically, they've amassed a following of sorts.
yes, but s so this is why I think there's a little bit of a difference here in that and so I forget who somebody kinda jokingly said it, like, let's say you had a statement that 9 out of 10 dentists recommend flossing. The Joe Rogan is gonna find the one dentist that says, "Actually, you don't need to floss." So when you're growing a massive following in a podcast, primarily based on the counter perspectives and opinions,
Mhm,
then you have the largest podcast in the world of all of the people who are always looking for the alternative to everything, which,
mhm,
by the way, is a ton of fun a lot of times too. And that whole group is going to point to all the times in which the gatekeepers and the experts were wrong. I mean, and there are plenty of examples there. So uh, fruit is ripe for the picking of saying, "Yep, the old guard, the gatekeepers, the critics, the experts, the political talking heads, the pundits, they don't know anything more about it than anybody else. Let's look at it from this other perspective." Fine
mhm,
and fun until you subconsciously adopt the perspective that the alternative perspective is always true and is the right one. And so you can be conditioned to think that the disenchanted opposite narrative is always the right one. And that might be funny when you're talking about actually there aren't any funny examples because people run to extremes with everything. But then it kind of came to a head with Rogan and Dave or Douglas Murray and Dave Smith because then they're talking about Israel, which Dave Smith has
mhm,
very well informed but very clear ideas about, and Douglas Murray, who has very informed and very clear ideas about. And it all came to a point where uh, Dave Smith was talking about what Israel was doing at the border crossings, and Douglas Murray's like, "Yeah, but when were you there?" And Dave Smith's like, "I've never been there." And then this kind of famous line now, he's like, "You've never been?" Or in the Douglas Murray, "You've never been?" Like, how can you talk about what's happening there if you haven't been there? Um, and so there's this idea of a conflict between, and then people are like, "Well, what? Just because I haven't been there, I can't have an opinion on this. Just because I haven't been there, I don't, I can't say what I
mhm,
think about this, or I can
mhm,
quote other experts on it." And so this whole like appeal to authority versus experience thing, and okay, people are like, what does this have to do with thinking out loud? It's going to have a lot to do with how we think about what counts as authority in church leadership.
Mhm.
So hang tight there. Um, of where it seemed to me that there is a developing tension between what does it mean to be an expert. And the problem with that is that anybody can have their expertise challenged at any point. So obviously, we would largely say we live in an anti-expert culture, but Douglas Murray is going to push back and say like, yeah, but there still are some experts that we want to have around who have like specific training in some things that you might want your heart surgeon to be a traditionalist sometimes. Yeah, like so there how do we define the categories where expertise is required? What does it mean to be an expert? And then what is the role that experience plays in developing trustworthy expert opinion and authority? So this seems to me, Cameron, to be the obvious continuation, the logical manifestation of the breakdown of all structures of authority into this amalgam of um, he who has the biggest platform is probably right, particularly if the platform traffics
Mhm.
in niche ideas. Those are the
My
things that get the
question
clicks, but it doesn't necessarily correspond then to anyway, I can go on and on, but save me here.
well, no, I have a question for you. What role do you think the pandemic played here? Yeah, I'm
Almost
wondering
all
whether that can
almost all of them are gonna quote something from COVID.
Mhm.
If you want the anti-expert line,
Right.
COVID is a easy pinata to take a whack at.
And what's interesting there is I think there have been some there was one discussion with Francis Collins, and I hesitate to bring this up because I try to make negative remarks advisedly, but basically I was very disappointed in this discussion. And it can be you can revisit it and listen to it, listeners, and draw your own conclusions. But I thought it was a major missed opportunity because Francis Collins is discussing the trust that was lost for, really for many scientists during the handling of the COVID-19 kind of the whole worldwide debacle. And I thought he did a poor job. He's brilliant and of course, but I thought he had the opportunity to speak reasonable words as a scientist and
Well,
show
yeah, but think of a time, Cameron, in the last 5 years in your life in which an expert has said, "We don't know. This is still developing. We'll have to watch and see."
and that's precisely what he didn't say. Yeah, as you can imagine, Nathan, what he said was people were very irrational and they should have trusted the science. I mean, in essence, that was his whole talk. Pretty disappointing, actually. Yeah, so no admissions. Now, a lot of that was we can talk more about this in as we go, but I mean, essentially, there's a false dilemma that emerges here when we consider expertise in some of these all or nothing terms, which are just really are silly. The notion that, well, either expertise leads, yields unassailable kind of findings, or it's bunk, which is silly. No, I mean, experts get things wrong. That doesn't mean doesn't constitute a scathing indictment of all expertise by any means. It just means we're dealing with human beings, and scientists are not sorcerers or magicians. They're human beings as well. I mean, just look at a team of doctors who are dealing with, the handling of a particular case of sickness or cancer or whatever it is, and you'll very quickly see the very human side of them trying to figure out the best route. They don't know perfectly and certainly, but they're doing the best that they can. But they're very much human beings working through this. There's nothing scandalous about that.
Uh, it's funny as you're saying that. So yes, but there is a group that lost all credibility as experts way before COVID and the pandemic, and those would be pastors and preachers. This is a funny category of expertise where there's
Mhm.
still a wide range of cultural difference on this within the United States for sure, where you have from the South where people like would introduce themselves as pastor, like some churches even to the like they refer to the pastor's wife as first lady or something. Like a very
Sure.
expertise culture there. clear to the opposite extreme, where if you said that you were a pastor or a preacher, that would be the way to delegitimize
right? So
anything you said the fastest possible. Um, and so, like, expert opinion in theology has largely been seen as totally bunk, probably since like the 50s. Um, and there's cultural and academic and German reasons for that. But yeah, so I think we're not seeing something new here. We're
mhm.
seeing the skepticism toward expertise applied to new categories that people previously thought were unassailable. Trust the science, and now in the podcast realm and post COVID era, now we get to question everybody on everything all the time, and there's something exciting about it until you need somebody to replace us, do bypass surgery.
There is. I mean, and Douglas Murray himself has been involved in another debate that was kind of on the other side, where he argued that the mainstream media has a trust problem. Remember, that was against Malcolm Gladwell and another interlocutor, and he was
Oh,
taking
is
a somewhat
uh, the guy who did
it'll
the
come.
Twitter leak stuff,
Mhm.
Matt
Yep,
Talib?
that sounds right, yes.
Yeah, was he in there? Okay.
So so there, Douglas Murray was kind of sounding a bit of a different note, not inconsistent with what he's saying here, but basically, he would be the first to admit there's a trust problem there for a reason. It didn't arise in a vacuum. So the talking back piece makes a whole lot of sense. But just we'll come back to this expertise versus experience or populist versus kind of more elite discussion, I suppose. But the other another piece here that I think is worth mentioning, and it sounds like Douglas Murray went after this, is the kind of disingenuous note that's rung by some of these people who say that they disavow any responsibility. Now, we need to make some meaningful distinctions. Earlier talked about celebrities like Elvis Presley, all the way up to Lil Wayne, and then Chapel Roan and Katy Perry, people like that. So let's make some meaningful distinctions. Some of these people I've mentioned are, they're rock stars, pop stars, and performers. Some of them are, maybe actors, people like that. But then there are people who like Joe Rogan or some of these comedians who have platforms where they are speaking directly into social issues in a
Mhm.
very explicit way, okay? Much more explicitly than a Katy Perry returning from space. And so here to say on the one I think it makes a lot more sense, for
Wait, are
instance.
you saying you didn't learn a lot about space travel from Katy Perry's comments?
Hey,
Shame on you,
yes,
Cameron.
well, yeah. Am I saying that she sounded like Carl Sagan? I don't know, but hear me out carefully. So if Katy Perry or somebody like her, Chapel Roan, you name it, if they say, "Look, I'm mainly a pop star and a performer. I don't want to be partisan all the time. I don't want to speak into these issues." Actually, I think it makes a whole lot more sense coming from them. Even though people these days will scream and yell and say, "That's not true. You have this platform, you have responsibility, blah blah blah." But it makes more sense.
Yeah,
But it doesn't but it
but
doesn't make as much sense if Joe Rogan says that, I
but
think,
so
or some major comedian.
no, you're right, but it's pointing to a shift in that on one hand, I am sympathetic to the performer that theoretically we would um, have filters in our own lives where we could sort through who we took to be credible in a way that we could parse out the people who weren't claiming to be like I so in my mind, I don't think anybody is like, "Oh, Katy Perry goes to space and comes back and talks about all the love, therefore we know more about astronomy." Um, nobody thinks of Katy Perry as an
I hope
expert.
not.
Uh,
Yeah.
so I'm saying on the flip side, people do take Joe Rogan seriously on
Yes.
political commentary and issues. And so why does Joe Rogan is not more politically qualified than Katy Perry? Like, how work
Careful. Just kidding.
yeah, yeah.
Careful.
The wheels are the gears are grinding in
You're
my mind here of
you're in
like
a minefield here. Yeah.
ho so why do some people get more cultural cred with it's subconscious and it's assumed even if it's not actually there? Um, help me dance through this minefield here of
Well, I think it has to do with the nature of their platforms. Katy Perry's main platform is Perry. Her main platform is performance. She's a pop singer.
Mhm.
With Joe Rogan, and let's not forget, I mean, Joe Rogan actually has a long career. So he did actually, he's not like some major outsider. He has a long career in broadcasting, started as a comedian as well. So, but he was also, he was a UFC commentator. I mean, and he was the host of Fear Factor. I mean, he has done a lot with mainstream media as well. So let's just not conveniently forget that piece. I'm not saying that makes him one of them. I'm just saying he has quite the resume, and he has a lot of experience with mainstream media kind of channels. But his platform is not mainly as a pop singer or performer. At least I hope not. I don't think anybody wants to hear Joe Rogan sing. He is a commentator. He's a I mean, in a sense, he's speaking directly into some of the key issues of our day, and having some of those key people come on his podcast. In some ways, Nathan, sometimes when these people will, like the Joe Rogans and others like him, who when they'll speak directly into these social issues, and then they'll stand back and say, well, I mean, I'm just a podcast host. I'm just a comedian. It reminds me a little bit of the person who would self-identify themselves as a skeptic or an atheist, and they would say, "Well, no, no, I mean, I'm not on the hook for any kind of arguments here. I just deny or strongly think that all of the evidence points against the existence of God. I mean, that's all. I don't have any really solid beliefs, so I don't really have to be responsible for anything that I say. It's not a belief system at all. It's just a denial. There's that
Mhm.
kind of, but no, you clearly stand for something.
Yeah,
You
it feels
have
slippery,
commitments.
but
Yeah,
it appeals to the crowd who already thinks, I'm not like the insiders, therefore where do I find the voice that is also not part of the insiders?
mhm,
That's the and so it's fun and games when you're on certain theories, but then I think the one Douglas Murray's pointed out too, yeah, what you think about Hamas, what you think about whether or not Winston Churchill was the one who was responsible for aggression toward Germany. You know, it some of those things you're playing with some pretty big historical ideas and complex and I think, Cameron, that at the root of it, as I'm because a lot of the stuff we could say, why should we care? And you're listening to this and you're like, why do I care what these guys think? Well, just because you don't care doesn't mean that a whole lot of people don't, and that these aren't
sure.
massively culturally influential things. But as I was listening to this work itself out, I was thinking it's because we're dealing with deeply complex human life, human culture, history,
Mhm.
politics, all of it.
Yeah.
It's multivariable and super complicated, and you can overemphasize one variable to the exclusion of any in almost any type of situation. And so there's a need for like a holistic look at it. There's a need for a look at the implications of it. There's a need for the people who have actually worked through who's been discredited or who's, relied on false sources or who's been found, liable of plagiarism or and so what really set people off is Douglas Murray's like, I don't need to listen to that guy's opinion for 30 hours on something because I already know that his sources have been debunked. And they're like, well, how can you comment on it if you haven't listened to it? And I think it
Yeah.
came down to him saying kinda like, "Yeah, there's some stuff that is nuanced, and the nuanced angle is always fun, except for sometimes there's stuff that isn't nuanced, and it's just right or wrong." That seems to be
Yeah.
the backlash against, like, anything goes. You're gonna start having this and so Sam Harris is gonna come to Douglas Murray's defense and be like, "Yeah, what he's saying is factually, rationally true. This is how, I look at this,
Well,
as an atheist."
anybody who's ever done any kind of professional studying or work or academic work or any other kind of professional field knows that that's a necessity. If you just indiscriminately took in everything
Yeah,
and
but
your
that is our cultural moment,
minus
Cameron.
it is.
This
No, I
this is
know.
where we have to
Yep.
figure out how to go back in the other direction responsibly without denying the problems of the experts in the past.
So much of thinking well these days is learning to say no to a lot of the stuff that's out there. And to recognize, nope, that's not even worth your time. It would be a waste of time. It's such an overabundance. So here's another feature of expertise that flies directly in the face of our cultural moment. It's necessarily narrow in scope. So
Mhm.
somebody who is an expert, who's let's say a foreign correspondent, who is an expert on kind of North Korean foreign policy, So this person's expertise is narrowly concentrated on a specific type of politics and a specific set of policies, or somebody's a microbiologist. You can't be you can't be an expert on absolutely everything. Your lens is necessarily narrowed, and so when you seek expertise, you're necessarily limiting your scope, and you're thinking, so in other words, an expert has thought really, really well and carefully and attained some professional accolades in one really, really tiny place. Kind of like when somebody gets a PhD. I mean,
Ah,
you're
yeah,
zeroed in on
except
a leaf on a tree in a massive rainforest.
yes, except reality is and I think that's a pile of fun, and what you said is absolutely true. It's a pile of fun to meet somebody who has deep expertise in a narrow field and can often, like, blow your mind on something, and that's a hoot to learn from people like that. The flip side is that reality still tends to pitch us stuff that nobody is actually an expert in. So,
Mm,
the United States did not have anybody the world didn't have anybody who was an expert in global pandemics. There were 0 global pandemic experts who had experience managing global pandemics. Now, there are people who are deeply informed about the physiology, the medical world, about the rest of it, but we are still going to run into situations in life. There are no experts on what it's like to walk on Mars. I could come up with a huge list of stuff that there is actually no human expertise on this. And so that I think comes to the part where there are going to have to be parameters where we're like, I try to do this with my kids. Like, your kids can quickly ask you, get in a line of thinking and asking questions to the point where there isn't a known scientific or theological understanding of what's going on there. And I will I enjoy when they get there because those are good questions where you're like, you know what, nobody has figured that out yet.
mhm.
But maybe you will be the person to do it. Like, that's exciting. Like, there's an I guess I live with a sense of openness to the unknown and act as if the unknown is still a category that we can explore rather than expecting everybody to have everything tidied up in a neat little tidy package of knowledgeology that I can just download in a 3-minute and 27-second YouTube video whenever I need it. So I'm wondering too if that isn't part of the posture toward like the nature of reality that I think there is so much more that we don't know about that how does that factor into this a little bit?
Yeah, well, and I'm just trying to give some perspective on what expertise is and what it can do and what it can't do in the first place. But it's a practical truth that we walk by faith, not by sight. That is not a purely religious observation. It's true because we're not omniscient. And certain notions of, or maybe mythic understandings of expertise along the lines of modernism would see in it the possibility of some kind of control that's just not possible for human beings. Yes, you're right. A massive cloud of unknowing is ever before us. And as some of the leading experts will tell you in the realms of science, the more we study, the more mysterious the world and everything is. I mean, think about when quantum physics emerged. I mean, how it remains mind-blowing and utterly bizarre and utterly surprising, and so nobody could have ever imagined it. It's something that's so beyond the scope of our imaginings, and there are more discoveries like that. Many, many, many more ahead of us. So, we walk by faith, not by sight. And now we just don't wanna gravitate to some of these naive responses where, well, all expertise is then invalidated and we go down a path of kind of total populism or total relativism. Well, absolutely not. No, expertise has its valid uses. I'm very grateful for neurosurgeons and for the systems of accreditation. I'm very grateful for architects and how unbelievably difficult it is to become an architect. This is good, but it doesn't change the fact that we're also going to have to live by wisdom as well, and
Ah,
wisdom involves learning how to adapt when we don't know the way forward. A lot of stuff was done wrong during COVID, but a lot of there were a lot of really good things that happened in COVID as well. There's lots of great collaboration happening, lots of and we continue to learn, don't we? When mistakes were made, huge mistakes. But lessons were also learned as well, and this is part of how we work as human beings.
But there are categories still where it's like the I think expertise as a tool, not a tyrant, is the paradigm that I probably live in. Like,
Sure.
I'm glad that there are experts in, um, child physiology, but I don't read a lot of books on how to parent my kids. And in fact,
Yeah,
I'm quasi skeptical of a whole lot of like academic psychic theory on child rearing
sure.
from somebody who doesn't have kids but has a PhD in the topic. There are still those categories where I'm like, no, I don't think like I don't
Yeah.
really think you know what you're talking about there. Or and I tell like people who are about to have their first baby all the time. I'm like, you know what is terrible? Mommy blogs. It's like somebody who had a baby and then ensure that their experience speaks for the other 7.5 billion people on the planet. Like, how do we say there's a an expert framework of knowledge here that we can reference as we need it, but it does not have a
L
tyrannical status
let
that we feel like we have to capitulate to every single dictate of what Harvard Business School thinks about child rearing. And so there's I find myself caught in between, Cameron, being deeply grateful for the academic work that some people have put in, and then also wanting to draw distinct lines of where there
yeah.
are boundaries that can't cross for just the sheer diversity and complexity of the human experience.
I think I mean, some good kind of principles that are coming back over and over again in all of these discussions, and I'm not just talking about us, I'm talking about a number of different social thinkers and historians especially keep saying this, is to do less better. What does that mean? Well, mommy blogs didn't exist 100 years ago, and that was probably a
Sorry
fortunate.
to pick on mommy blogs. Pick something else.
Yes,
I
I
don't
mean,
know.
we could pick something else, of course, but they didn't exist. But what did happen was people didn't go to blogs. They drew if it was, an ideal circumstances, they drew from the people in their communities. Ideally, they were people in their church. Yeah, and this is not I mean, this is one of the byproducts of church, with the primary reason we go to church isn't to, help have people help us raise our children, but that is one of the healthy byproducts of it
It's a
of
big
good.
part of it.
It's a huge part of it. That's why a lot of people are going back to church even when they've walked away for a while. They recognize, "Hey, we want these people pouring into our families." But so think smaller, think more in terms of your community. Now the problem is in the modern world, a lot of us our alienation isn't just some word in a sociology book. It's something that people are really dealing with. They really, we often don't know our neighbors and we do feel disconnected, but we need to try to get away from searching for answers all the time and, in sort of far away blogs and, among all of these different supposed child rearing engineers and all. I mean, I'm just picking on one particular easily pick onable sector. But if we think we want to take in less, and I think in some ways do less better. And
Mhm.
that has to do also with the content that I hate the word content. What we're reading, what we're bringing before our minds. I mean, it's perfectly possible to have more and more going into our heads all the time with every activity. Every time we're doing anything, we have a podcast playing or we've got some new information droning in our ears. But sometimes, I mean, we can only handle so much of it. And also, we want to prioritize what we pay attention to and who we pay attention to. And sometimes the people who are in our lives, who love us, who know our children, who know our families, who know our habits, they're going to speak with more personal and relational authority
Mhm.
than
Mhm.
some PhD who doesn't know you. Again,
The
and this is not an anti expertise speech. I shouldn't
No,
even have to
yeah.
say that. But yeah,
There's a Bruce Lee quote that I love where he said, "I don't fear the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks once. I fear the man who has practiced one kick 10,000 times." And we live in a culture that celebrates novelty of everybody being an expert on everything for about 15 minutes and then moving on to the next thing. And I see that tendency in my life to want to find people who have done something well for a long time. Even if it's a how-to like YouTube video and they're like, "Well, what we're going to do." And I'm like, "Nope, X." I want to find the person who's like, "Well, for the last 15 years, this
I
is
built
what we've done."
birdhouses. I'm just kidding.
Right, yeah. Yeah, exactly.
But yeah,
Of that kind of, and so for me, church attendance is where I find the people who have lived in one place for 57 years
yeah.
and thought about human relationships and people, and maybe I'm just going to them and saying, "Hey, what books would you recommend on this?" But I'm narrowing my area of focus academically or in the professional categories of expertise because it's filtered through the collective wisdom of people who actually have lived experience of saying, I found this to be helpful, or like, hey, here's a life hack. Think about doing it this way. So I think a couple things. One, I want to be clear in my mind about narrowing who I listen to and asking myself, why am I studying or what am I looking at this and what's the motivation there? Is this the better part of wisdom or is it just simply a silly distraction? And then the second part, Cameron, that I think is incumbent upon all of us, the two of us and everybody listening, is to grow to be the kinds of people who have something actually worth saying, that when somebody comes along and says, hey, you're 10, 15 years older than me, how did you work through this? That we can thoughtfully and humbly engage with that and say, yeah, actually, I did learn a couple things along the way. And I've got the scars to show it, and I've got the fruit to show here also. And let me help you think through this. And so I think our culture has a shortage of grandparently wisdom that we should all be striving to develop in our. If you are yearning for that and don't have it in your life, then perhaps God is calling you to become that. And that can only happen through time. Jesus had an interesting, as I was thinking about all of this, is interesting. Jesus says this interesting little line, so simple, so true, and you will know them by their fruit, not by their, not by the size of their following, not by the novelty of the idea, not by, you could fill in the blank there, you just know them by their fruit. And so let's look for people who are producing mature, ripe, nutritious fruit and learn and study with them. And then let's also be open handed before the Lord that we would be crafted and grown through our life experiences and the other things that God wants to teach us into people who then can also legitimately be helpful in addressing the complexity and the joy and the beauty of what comes up in human relationships and human communities. And so I feel a desire and a calling and a longing to grow in both directions, um, at the same time of looking forward to the people who have gone well before me, and then also learning that myself, and then teaching it to those who come after me. And so I think that's one of the places where we can think deeply about the impact of community and friendship and geographic stability and those types of things that AI will never replace because they preserve forms of knowledge that can't be digitally replicated. And so those, like, just as I say that, be aware that that exists and is a real thing. It's not a fantasy, and look for ways to lean into those categories of learning and knowledge and fruit production. Um, so we can take the rest of it with a grain of salt, as the advice is cheap these days.
You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.